I know about your scholarship to Brown.
Only way we're going back out in the fields without you. Kilmer said 48 minutes, the next 48 years of our lives.
I say we go out there and we'll leave it all out on the field. We got the rest of our lives to be mediocre, but we have the opportunity to play like gods.
Let's be heroes.
Hey there everybody, welcome back to today's video. Today's video is a little sensitive because the movie we are going to talk about is a movie where a lot of the cast members are not around with us anymore. So you've already seen the starting of the video. Varsity Blues. This is one of those movies that came at the peak of the teen exploitation era in the late 90s, where a lot of the movies were starring actors in their early 20s or mid 20s or sometimes in their late 20s as well, who were playing characters that were teenagers or in that coming of age phase. Varsity Blue is just one of those movies that happened to be released at the same time, and it turned out to be a cult classic. Today I'm going to discuss this movie in detail and find out whether this movie is still watchable after all these years, because I've watched it a couple of times and believe me, it was one of the finer movies of that era in this particular genre. Hey there everybody, how's it going? This is John and you're watching CineManiacs 24/7, the channel dedicated to movies, music, physical media, books, video games and pop culture. Varsity Blues is a 1999 coming-of-age sports drama film that was directed by Brian Robbins, and it starred an ensemble cast of some of the most recognizable faces in the entire teen exploitation genre or in the young actors genre. You had James Van Der Beek, Ali Larter, Rob Lester and Paul Walker in some of the lead roles of the film. And Dawson's Creek is one of the many reasons I happen to know James Van Der Beek, and Paul Walker is, of course, Fast and Furious fame, and Ali Larter comes from the first two Final Destination films. This is a movie that's set somewhere in rural Texas, if I'm not mistaken. The entire idea of the film being that they're talking about a town where football is apparently the religion of many of the people there. It's taken as a very serious thing, and there's our hero trying to break out of the town and find something outside the entire town. Meanwhile, the entire town is so convinced that football is their life, and there's a coach that's played very well by Voight, who happens to be a very authoritative and a brutal figure that does not really have any filter on him, and he's relentless, uses blunt language, sometimes downright insulting language as well. But yeah, that's what it is. So this is a movie we're going to talk about today. I'll start off with the positives and the negatives first, but believe me, this is one of those movies that never really got its due. Trust me, it had a lot of elements. Sure, a lot of them were not handled well, but there are things in the movie that will make sense. And as we keep digging in, we shall find out why. The movie has a fairly simple premise, if I be honest with you. The entire idea is that there's a small town in Texas where everybody has an obnoxious obsession with football. Everybody wants to believe that football is the only way this town can survive. No wonder why the parents and the coach himself, played brilliantly by Mr. Jon Voight, every one of them has an obsession around football. Everyone except James Van Der Beek, who of course is an exception here in the entire film. Then you have the character of Lance Harbor, which is played fabulously by Paul Walker, R.I.P. the soul, who is injured in a match that is probably one of the most deciding moments in the entire film, and of course a turning point as well, where you see that the entire direction of the plot goes into a different way, because now James Van Der Beek happens to be taking charge of the team after Harbor essentially is stalled for a year because he has a leg injury. And of course he comes back as a coach in the end. We'll talk about that. But the entire movie essentially revolves around a guy trying to escape a pressure cooker environment where not a lot of things are aligning with what he wants to do, and the idea that James Van Der Beek actually makes it to Brown University in the end based on his academic merit rather than his football scholarship is again a different thing in its own way. And of course, like an antidote, or let's say an anti movie to The Faculty, where the character of Stan was basically the jock who was trying to make it to college, but he wanted to get into academics rather than actually being the jock in the entire school, which of course is one of the best parts about The Faculty. You can see that video on my channel anyway. So if I talk about one of the best parts of the movie, that definitely has to be the pressure cooker environment they created, where every character is trapped in a way because there's no other choices and options given to them. Do I have to really mention the idea that Jon Voight's coach Kilmer was one of the most blunt, ruthless, and sometimes downright verbally abusive person you might have ever met in a teen exploitation film. I'm not talking about film history in general. This movie is not a masterpiece of any chance, but it still has elements that can make you take it seriously. John Voight's character as the coach was one of the most serious and intense parts about this film. Believe me, a guy who does not have any sort of remorse, any sort of filter. He's just blunt, relentless, and you can already see in a couple of the scenes that I've attached how he's basically a ruthless guy who just does not want to take no for an answer, who just doesn't want to accept that the team loses. He's a guy operating on a massive amount of pressure. That character was played very well, and believe me, I have not seen a character in this particular genre of this kind, of this caliber, being ever shown. Of course, The Skulls had its own different version. Cruel Intentions had a different version. There was American Pie, there was Final Destination, so many other movies with the same kind of actors who eventually faded from existence for some reason. But yeah, John Voight's Coach Kilmer had to be one of the best characters in the entire film. The movie lays a very good amount of emphasis on individual freedom, the way I see it, because the character of James Van Der Beek is trying to make a very good choice of pivoting outside the ecosystem that he was given and trying to build a new life for himself, which of course is a very, very mature theme for a film of this sort. And the idea that movies like Cruel Intentions, Final Destination were not this emotionally mature. If I compare this movie with another movies, or let's say another set of movies within the same genre, within that same timeline of release, this movie surprisingly looked a little mature to me. The idea that Paul Walker ends up being a coach in the end. He coaches his team and leads them to victory, while Coach Kilmer quietly exits the team. Of course, there's a particular moment you can find out in the film where he's even visible in the final shot. Of course, not something that everybody can notice, but yeah, it's what it is. So putting all that into context, I believe the individual freedom was one of the best concepts that they ever managed to master in this movie. Every character has some choices. There's Billy Bob, that is played by the late Rob Lester, who's having his own issues and struggling with his own health, but manages to do well in the end. There is, of course, the character of Ali Larter, who, by the way, is just eye candy in this movie. She doesn't have much of a substantial character-based role, but again, that's classic Hollywood doing classic Hollywood stuff anyway. Then there was also Amy Smart, who apparently happened to be Paul Walker's sister, correct me if I'm wrong there, who also had a substantially good character in the movie and was James's love interest, if I'm not mistaken, and even they reconcile in the end. So these are the three positives that I remember. Good performances by John Voight and the lead pair, in my understanding. Then also the idea that they created a very good pressure cooker environment where you can already see that James Van Der Beek is at its breaking point now, and he's not able to cope up with that kind of pressure. The third thing being that, the individual freedom concept was explored genuinely well. Now let's talk about the flaws of the film, in my understanding. Well, if we talk about the negatives of the movie can be classified as for the following. This movie lacks a very strong director. It is one of the biggest problems that teen exploitation movies had way back in the late 90s and early 2000s. The directors were not exactly very big people, only leaving the exceptions of Kevin Williamson, who has a very powerful filmography and of course is one of the creators of Dawson's Creek, one of my favorite TV shows at this point. I have to say that this movie and a lot of the movies in its similar genre had problems with directors. They ended up being cult classics in their own way, but somehow remained confined to their own time. Gen Z kids are not exactly going back to explore these movies or, feel the very same thing that the audience back then could have felt. But again, to each his own. I'm not exactly saying that you're supposed to feel bad about them or good about them, but this is just a personal opinion. The director was not exactly the best kind of person to carry this movie forward. Second of all, in my understanding, this movie's character dynamics and plot dynamics were very reminiscent to movies of its similar genre. Think about this. This movie has exactly the same kind of characters, or let's say the same kind of write-ups that movies like The Skulls, Final Destination, American Pie, and sometimes even movies like Cruel Intentions had. All of these movies have very similar characters and recurring bunch of characters, and more or less of the same age as well. If in case I'm wrong, correct me there. Most of the characters are coming of the same age group and of the same kind of generation as well. Most of them were Generation X actors, that is born between 1965 to 80. And I guess a lot of the movies had very similar dynamics. the dynamics being very painfully similar in this one as well. They could have added a little bit of, suspense, maybe in my understanding, a little bit of weight or drama in the movie. You could have shown the deaths of one of the characters. You could have probably shown that one of the characters is rendered permanently, you know, unplayable because something happened to him. That sort of thing was not existing in this movie. The movie could have been more dramatic and more weightful, but of course that didn't happen. The final criticism that I would like to say is that the concept of this film was very good. The idea that you're talking about a small town where people are all living in a closed pressure cooker type of environment where there's no freedom, there's no right to choose what you want to. Everybody's obnoxiously obsessed with a particular sport because they believe it'll make their lives better. This topic could have been handled very well. But this is just the criticisms of the film, and of course idea that parts of the movie have not aged well with time. But then again, it's just that too many years have passed and too many decades have gone by in between. The sensibilities have changed, but it still remains an entertaining movie. We get to the conclusion section right away. So if I was to talk about my final statements on the movie, I will say that this was a very good film, released at a very good time when films were not exactly commercialized the way they were, and of course the seminal young cast was an eye candy in my understanding. Although parts of it could have been better, but yeah, this is the film that we have in hand. Thank you so much guys for watching this review. If you have until this point, please subscribe to my channel and keep buying films on physical media. That's the best and the most amazing way to protect movies for long. Stay safe, bye bye, and Godspeed.